Hello, and welcome to Setting the Stage, Conversation of Performing Arts Health, a webinar where we talk about current issues in the field of performing arts health and speak with researchers regarding the state of the field. My name is Brian McGoldrick. I'm currently a second-year PhD student in the Performing Arts Health program at the University of North Texas, subspecializing in research measurement statistics. And today we have a very special guest, one of our first international guests. We have Dr. Karendra Devroop, who is a full professor and acting director at Unisa. Dr. Devroop, welcome.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you for having me here.
No, thank you. Thank you. It's a treat. Before we get started, I was wondering if you could just kind of introduce yourself, your background, and then from there, I think we'll get into some of the performing arts health stuff.
Sure. I am currently the acting director of music at the University of South Africa, which is a pretty large institution with about 400,000 students. In music, we have two divisions. We have an academic program where you could do your bachelor's, master's, PhD. And then we have a second division where we host our international competitions, a concert series, a very large community engagement project for disadvantaged kids, international projects with conservatories, universities across the world, special projects with embassies, a couple of festivals, jazz festival, classical music festival, etc. So I manage all of that, and we also have a huge examinations division. It's kind of like this Royal School Associated Board. We have exams across the world. In addition to my day job, I am a saxophone player. So I do play a lot of concerts. Internationally, got a bunch of recordings out. Interestingly, I was just in the US. My last concert that I did was in the US in Denver with the Lamont Symphony Orchestra. Awesome. I was a soloist. And I had to cut the tour short due to the pandemic. Yep. So I enjoy performing. I enjoy, holding down my regular position and research. My background is I was born in South Africa, in Pietermaritzburg, South Africa, and I did my bachelor's and master's degrees here in South Africa, and kept applying for scholarships. And almost 10 years later, I finally got a scholarship to go to the US to do my PhD at University of North Texas. Finished up the doctorate, and then I spent another 8-10 years teaching in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and conducting research, performing, and eventually I returned back to South Africa.
Awesome. And was it a fairly quick transition back to your current position at Unisa?
Yeah, there were some changes because when I had left to go to the US, this was around end of 97, we were just 3 years into democracy.
Okay.
And the country had barely changed. And when I returned 2010, we were firmly into democracy. Institutions had changed. Our way of thinking had changed. My mindset had changed tremendously because I was in the US. I was exposed to a totally different educational system. So I was able to bring that knowledge and training back to South Africa, which to me was fantastic because I could institute new programs. So getting back to South Africa was not too much of a problem. Trying to institute some of these programs were more of a challenge because a lot of institutions were still based on the traditional mindset, which is more the European conservatory approach. One-on-one lessons as opposed to large ensembles like in the US. But I was able to come through and institute a bunch of those ideas. And now we have successful, wind bands, orchestras. Research is growing. One of the challenges for me, though, was in South Africa, and to this date, research in music is more qualitative. In fact, I am in the music field. There's probably 2 or 3 of us that are quantitative researchers. That's purely because of my training in the US. Majority of South Africans, tend to hit Europe. so that's been a bit of a challenge, getting my colleagues to buy into quantitative research, which I was exposed to at UNT and definitely at the Texas Center for Performing Arts. That was my training ground, which kind of helped with that transition.
That's really interesting, because I guess in a more traditional music academia, we think to theory, to history, to things like that. It is, I guess, based mostly on a qualitative model on various, like CQR and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, so I'm sure you can imagine despite UNT being the place where you learn some of these methods, it's still an uphill climb to get a lot of that, a lot of those mixed methods, much less just quantitative stuff into kind of firmly ingrained into music. I think it's making progress, but yeah, that's really interesting to hear. So, yes.
Well, I think one of the reasons I got exposed to quantitative research is because I think in my second year I met Dr. Kris Chesky by accident. He had been traveling to South Africa for a conference, and somebody mentioned to him, "Hey, there's a student from South Africa," and he said, "Let's go grab some coffee," and that's what we did. And he says, "Well, what should I expect? In terms of my trip, the country." At the time, crime was pretty high, and we had a long discussion. And then he asked me what I was doing, and I said, "Well, I'm doing I'm doing my doctorate." And he said, "Well, you should consider, coming through and working at that time it was called the Texas Center for Music and Medicine." And I was very fortunate that I was afforded a research assistantship, which threw me into the deep end in terms of quantitative research, because that's what the Center for Performing Arts Health does, and really sharpened my skills. And I think for me, that's the primary reason why I got into quantitative research and the kind of research. Now, had I been at a different school, I think the outcome would have been totally different. But it's thanks to that assistantship and working with Dr. Chesky that I developed these skills, and I was able to, to get into the field of performing arts health.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. Yeah, again, I mean, I speak largely from similar experience. Masters in performance, and my knowledge of anything quantitative was self-taught, which can be pretty inefficient with stats. There's a lot of places to start, and you don't always know what the best place is. But yeah, it's been a trip, but I do agree it is a bit transformative. You learn a lot of that stuff, and it kind of changes the way you look at everything in general. For better and worse, I guess, but mostly for the better.
That's true. Yeah.
But yeah, speaking of the center, and we've kind of gone over your intro a little bit. I was wondering if you could kind of, just kind of briefly talk about what your time there entailed, kind of what you noticed as the center progressed, and just the kind of research that you were interested in while at the center.
Good question. I would say there were two parallel developments taking place when I started at the center, which was about 98, 99. The center was just establishing itself. I think Dr. Chesky had it up and running for about 3 or 4 years. And I was probably the second or third research associate at the center. So I was finding my feet as a researcher, as a doctoral student. And I guess the center was starting to expand. And at the time, Dr. Chesky was starting to implement his ideas in terms of growth and where the center should be heading. I was just a naive student. I just bought into all of it. For me, it was, this is the way it's done. And in hindsight, now I realize the vision that Dr. Chesky had at the time was just leagues ahead of where it should have been. This idea of conducting quantitative research on performing arts health was unheard of. I mean, there was PAMA, yes, and they were doing a lot of research, and there were a lot of independent researchers across the country that were working in this field, but they were mostly physicians or people in the medical fields. And this was the first time that a center based at a college of music was attempting to assemble a group of the most highly trained individuals, from engineers like Prof. George Kondrowski and Dr. John Hippel and Dr. Bernard Rubin, different fields, from rheumatology, audiology, and here we were at this, in a music college, in a center in a music college, trying to assimilate these ideas and figure out how do we address this research. And one of the things that struck me was Kris's approach had always been, it has to be collaborative, because he and I at the time, we knew music. We know what a musician goes through and what we experience, but we did not know, the medical field or the audiology or engineering. So we needed those like-minded people to come together, sit at the table to say, well, okay, we want to conduct a study on the biomechanics of trumpet performance. How do we do this? Kris is a trumpet player. I've been involved in ensembles, been playing in big bands, but you needed George Kondrowski, who was the engineer, to say, well, here's how we would quantitatively measure mouthpiece forces. And Bernard Rubin saying, well, but you cannot overexert the physical anatomy of the trumpet player with those kinds of exercises if you want to measure quantity. So it was this like-minded people coming together, and it was not easy at the time because it was just unexplored territory. And I think Dr. Chesky felt that's where the center needed to be. They needed to push these new ideas, expand on the research. I remember the first study that we looked at on mouthpiece forces of trumpet players. The researchers had measured mouthpiece forces with a fish scale, lying upside down. So you imagine somebody lying on a flat table and someone placing a fish scale with weights on there. And that's how, these forces were measured, which now was a very archaic way of doing it. But the team at the time, led by Kris, he felt, we've got to do this with the latest technology. So we've got to figure out, how do we cut the lead pipe on the trumpet to measure these forces? How can we measure the intraoral pressure? And that, for me now, in a personal development, was just incredible. I mean, this had never been done. And here I was as a young student being immersed into all of this. So as the center was growing and finding their feet in terms of, well, how do we address medical problems of different instrument categories, vocalists, while also addressing mental health, which was a big issue, and hearing loss, which was an even bigger issue. There were all these balls in the air, and we're trying to figure out, well, how do we keep them afloat, but without doing a disservice to the research? We cannot just produce substandard research. So that was fascinating. For me personally, as a young student, it was a steep learning curve, because suddenly Dr. Chesky was saying, well, you need to go read up on all of these studies in the medical journals on embouchure dystonia and facial paralysis. And I was thrown in trying to read these journals with terminology that I simply did not understand. But I tried to figure it out because I knew this was important. And that's kind of what inspired me most. Going outside of my area. In my doctoral studies, I was getting all the research methods in terms of music, and music makes you smarter, and the Ed Gordon research and the Elliott research. But this to me was really stimulating. So personally, I was growing at a tremendous rate. But at the same time, Kris Chesky told me personally, you would have to throw yourself in the deep end and start conducting these studies. You cannot just be someone that's sitting on the sidelines as an observer. You need to go and figure out what studies do you want to do. And the thing that I felt easiest at the time was hearing loss, because I kind of understood that. At the time, Kris was working with these dosimeters that was measuring, doing these measurements on a very small unit that I felt I understood. And that was my first study. In fact, he said, well, go out and conduct a study on sound pressure levels for a drummer in the studio and in a performance environment, and just measure the difference. And we'll take it from there. And that was my very first study. And he kind of guided me all the way through, saying, well, you need to address this, you need to address that. And you cannot do this because, it does not get at the heart of the question. So I was developing, and I was very fortunate to have had Kris Chesky as a mentor, because he knew where I'd come from, he knew my background, he knew my weaknesses, but he also knew my strengths and capitalized on all of them. So that's kind of what threw me into the deep end. And the thing I was most grateful for, like you mentioned, you get thrown into this area and you try to figure it out, and you want to present at conferences. My very first conference paper, I remember Kris telling me, you write up the abstract, you create the poster. If you get accepted to the conference anywhere in the US or in Canada, I will pay for you to go to the conference. I will cover your costs on one condition, that at some point when you're teaching at a university, you do the same for a deserving young student. And that's what I did. I applied for an ISME conference in Canada, got a paper accepted, and Kris said, we're going to Canada. And he, as my mentor, he covered all of my expenses, as a typical struggling student. And I went in and presented the paper, and about 12 years later, I did the same for my first honors student at Elizabethtown College. I encouraged the student to present, and I would, cover the costs, and I hope, that the students did that further. While I was developing as a researcher and the center was developing, there was also a sense of mentorship, and that's critical to anyone in the research field, especially performing arts health. Because I remember Kris telling me when I first presented my very first public presentation, he says, when you get up there, you need to know your content, because leading researchers are going to question you. And you should know what you're talking about, because your reputation's at stake. Look the part, put on a suit, be articulate, and people will respect you. They'll take you seriously as a researcher. And I remember him constantly asking me, is that the best that you can do? Is that the absolute highest standard that you can reach for, whether it's writing an abstract or presenting a poster? It was always, he would throw out these terms like, you can take the high road or you can take the low road. Both will get you to your destination, but your reputation will be based on which road you took. So that kind of mentorship for me was invaluable. It's what shaped me as a researcher. It's what shaped me professionally as a musician. It's what shapes me in my current job when I have a whole bunch of staff that report to me. It's always the same principles, whether it's research or it's doing a job. Is that the best you can do? Is that the best representation? So to answer your question, I mean, personally, the most I've ever grown in my life as a researcher, as a professional person, was as a graduate assistant at the Center for Performing Arts Health.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. It's, yeah, no, it sounds transformative, and I certainly think that I and a lot of the students here can resonate with a lot of your experience, especially with, with regard to just getting thrown into it and
Yeah.
having to learn on the fly. But yeah, and it's interesting, at least now, we have, basically a cohort, and it is really interesting to see. We're all thrown into fairly similar situations, but just to see the varying interests, as they manifest. And
True.
you mentioned, hearing health, and admittedly that's where a lot of my early interest was. But we all kind of attack different things. I've couple colleagues that are, really into vocal health. They're
Right.
active performers, and so they're working on quantifying some of that stuff. I have a colleague who's really into health promotion. I myself really have dug into the mental health side of things. So it is interesting being thrown into a similar situation, and just
Yeah.
seeing how those interests kind of blossom into various things. So yeah.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, I think it seems overwhelming when you're at that time, because this is all new content. This is content that we're not familiar with. But I think developing those skills where you get thrown into the deep end and you've got to figure this stuff out will become part of who you are many years after you graduate. There's a saying that, your education, it never prepares you for a job. It provides you with some basic skills, and you learn the job on the job, because you've got to absorb so much, you've got to problem solve. And that's so true, because these skills that you develop right now, trying to figure out this new field, performing arts art, and it's a big field. It's complex. There is no one person who knows it all. It's been around 50, 70 years now, and we're still finding our feet. So as a student, you're going to experience that down the road. But I'll tell you what's going to impact you the most is that as a teacher, when you graduate, whether you are a researcher, a teacher at a university, at a school, a performer, you are going to see things that are going to strike put up a red flag for you to say, hey, that kid should not be doing that. When you see a kid blowing excessively into a trumpet with the cheeks all puffed, your training is going to tell you that's going to cause some damage down the road. And your instinct would be, I've got to address this. When you see, a pianist practicing 6-8 hours in a stretch in a practice room, I think you're going to realize that that's not the way to go. Yes, you should be practicing 6 to 8 hours, but you should be taking breaks. You should be resting. You should be doing stretching exercises, yoga, all the things that will assist with your endurance, because ultimately, that's going to do damage. And that's what I find now in my life. I see young kids with poor technique, and I realize this is going to be detrimental to you down the road. Or I see young researchers, I hate to say cutting board, but not being, fully compliant with the ethics of the research. And I know that's going to impact the results. So your training and the training for anyone in this field is going to impact you lifelong, whether you engage in performing arts health or not. It's vital. And I think that's one of the reasons why you mentioned some of your colleagues are into promotion, education. That's vital. I mean, it's one thing to be a researcher, but getting the information out, getting the knowledge out to the people who need it is probably more important than the research, because that's where the prevention kicks in.
Mhm.
We don't always want to be solving problems or curing. We rather be, prevention is the better route to go. It's least, far less detrimental, far less costly from a financial perspective,
Mhm.
and that's what we should be advocating.
Mhm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And at least to this point, certainly in a number of the classes that we take and a lot of the material we read, the promotion side of things, whether it's, theories of behavior, theories of playing behavior, all that fun stuff, is an integral part at this point, especially,
Good.
exactly because of the point you brought up. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
good.
yeah.
Yeah, that's important. And you're always going to get resistance to that. I
Mhm.
remember the very first time when I think the center advocated within the state of Texas to include some informational materials in instrument cases and so on. There was resistance initially to it.
Mhm.
And my memory, if my memory serves me correct, some of the instrument manufacturers were saying, "Wow, this sends the wrong message." It says, playing this instrument is detrimental. But I think the center and Kris and his colleagues were steadfast. This is important. We've got to get this message out. And if we get some backlash from instrument manufacturers, then so be it. We've got to take it. But getting the message out that wearing a neck strap on a clarinet significantly reduces pain on the right thumb is more important than some big shot businessman saying, "Well, we really don't want you to put this information in there because this does not make us look good."
Mhm.
And you've got to take those hard decisions. This is a controversial field.
Mhm.
You've got to take some tough choices and stick by them.
Mhm.
So advocacy, yeah, it's very
Yeah.
important.
Mhm. Speaking, because I really want to talk about your research a little bit, and one of the first papers I read when I came here, I can't remember if it was your dissertation or if it was the aspirations paper version of it, of the study you did in the U.S. And I know you've replicated the study in multiple samples, and I was wondering if we could talk about that a little bit, kind of what sparked that, because as we kind of discussed prior to the interview, this fast of aspirations versus expectations. Um, it has been topical, and it just became even more topical,
Right.
with the pandemic. So I was wondering if we could talk about that a little bit, and just namely, like where did the inspiration for those projects come from?
Well, funny enough that you mentioned that. So, I was going through my coursework at UNT and reading articles and dissertations and trying to find a topic.
Mhm.
The big thing, all doctoral students find the right topic, find something that interests you and so on. And one day I was at the Center for Performing Arts Health, working in my little space across from Dr. Chesky, and he had me pull some articles on, I can't remember whether it was hearing loss or mental health. And he came across an article, which was very, it was an article by Howard Becker done in 1953 on jazz musicians. And Howard Becker went into jazz clubs in New York, and this was in 1953. And he asked them, "Well, what's it like being a jazz musician?"
Mhm.
That was it. It was a very short article, probably no more than 2 pages. That was it. And Kris gave me this article, and he said, this is valuable because we don't really know why these jazz musicians get into jazz. What are they expecting? So he handed me this article, and he said, "This is interesting. You should look at this." And so I looked at it, and I said, "Wow, that's fascinating. I'd be curious to know why these musicians get into jazz." And so then he advised me, he says, well, start doing some research. And lo and behold, I did not find any articles. And then he said, well, go outside of music. You know, we always think everything revolves around music, but there's a whole world outside of music. So I began searching for expectations, job expectations. And lo and behold, I find this area by a huge body of research by a researcher called Farmer. And she had done research on people in agriculture, and then she had migrated to people in education on the types of jobs they like to have and the types of jobs they get. And hence the term job aspirations, meaning the job you aspire to have, and expectations, the job you realistically expect to get. And there's a difference. You know, everybody wants to be a principal, you know, trumpet player in the Houston Symphony or the, you know, at the Met. But in reality, even though you aspire to be in those orchestras, you may not necessarily get there. You may end up being a principal trumpet player in a regional orchestra, in a community orchestra. We all aspire to be like Wynton Marsalis. In reality, we may not be good enough, or the circumstances may not warrant that we get to that level, but we may be reasonably successful, and some of us will not be successful at all. So that's what sparked the interest. The other thing that sparked the interest is that I was playing with a bunch of big bands in the Dallas area while I was a student, and I would go to these big bands and I would play, and you know, there's 17 musicians, and the guitarist would say, "Oh, so what are you doing?" I say, "Well, you know, I'm at UNT." He's like, "Wow, I went to UNT back 30 years ago, and you know, I made the 2 o'clock lab band, or I made the 1 o'clock or the 3 o'clock." I'm like, "Wow, that's fantastic. So what are you doing now?" He's like, "Oh, I work for this company, and we sell these pool cleaners." Like, well, why are you working selling pool cleaning equipment? It's like, yeah, you know, there wasn't enough of work. And every time I played with big bands, there were more and more musicians who had done a bachelor's or a master's degree in music, but now they were working non-music jobs. That led me to believe, well, something's wrong with the system, because if you train to be a medical doctor, you become a medical doctor. You train, you become a doctor, and you're a doctor. You earn your income from being a doctor. And that's true for most professions, except for these jazz musicians. And that's when I started looking at all of this literature. It was primarily outside of music, and I said, well, we need to look at musicians at university students. And that's what led me to my dissertation. I realized we had the largest music school in the country at the time. Not UNT had the largest jazz program. But let's look at all of these students. What got them to the program? What was the training? What was the background? What kinds of jobs do they aspire to have? And what kind of jobs do they realistically expect to get? And there was a discrepancy. Doctoral studies found they all aspired to be famous jazz performers. But in reality, a lot of them expected to teach and work a combination of jobs in order to sustain themselves. So I took all of that, and you know, from my findings, I took all of that and I presented it back to the jazz faculty, and I said, hey, you know, there's a discrepancy. A lot of your students aspire to these jobs. Some of it is unrealistic. You know, back in 2000, some of the jazz musicians were expecting to earn $150,000 per year, which is not very realistic. And I had to go back to the jazz faculty to say, we need to be realistic with the students. There's nothing wrong with studying jazz and getting into the field, but diversify, do arranging, composition, some teaching, some performance, and you will be successful. It's what all the great guys do. It's the reason why Bob Mintzer teaches, and he plays, and he records, and he composes. They all do that. And they took that to heart. And so that study, when I completed that study, I realized, well, I would like to replicate this in South Africa with the population across the whole country. That's what we did. Similar findings. except the expectations were different in South Africa because our industry is not as big. And a colleague of mine who was from Mexico and a doctoral student with me at the time, she says, wow, this is fascinating. I would love to figure out the music education majors in Mexico. What are their aspirations and expectations? Because we've got a problem. They all want to be performers. And then they end up teaching, but there aren't any teaching jobs. So we did the same thing with the National University in Mexico, which has the largest music program. And we studied all of the music education majors, what were their aspirations and what were their expectations. And they're vastly different. And given this past year, I think this topic is probably the most important topic we can address right now, because the pandemic has completely reshaped the performance landscape. There's no two ways about it. There's orchestras that have shut their doors permanently. There's performance houses that have shut their doors permanently. The industry has been turned completely, on its head because performance has come to a standstill, and there's no certainty as to when all of this will come back. We assume it's going to come back in some form in the fall. We're hoping it'll be back in some fall next year. But keep in mind this, at that point, we are so far in debt. We don't know that clubs are going to survive. We don't know that the entire field, jazz, classical, all of it's going to come back. So then the question becomes, well, what do music majors now expect? I think the aspirations are still going to be the same. Mm-hmm. Since the years of Beethoven and Mozart, we've all aspired to be concert pianists and performers on stages with huge audiences. I think they're going to aspire to do the same, but the expectations are going to change, given the circumstances we find ourselves in. I speak informally to a lot of my colleagues in Los Angeles and in Europe. And in LA, an informal stat has been thrown out that more than 80% of the professional players have left the city. They've migrated out because they cannot sustain themselves. There's no work. They've either moved back to their hometowns, but they've just moved away from the city. And that's fascinating because then the expectations become important. For the handful of people that are there may be more work because there's fewer musicians. But if there's very little work, what are they going to do? We find the same in Europe. I've got a lot of friends in the UK, professional musicians, and majority of them have told me they've just given up on the profession completely. Jazz musicians have said, I'm done. I struggled before the pandemic. With this pandemic, there is no way I'm coming back. A lot of them are re-educating themselves and retooling themselves in other fields, fields that are going to be in demand, because at the end of the day, the realities of life kick in, earning an income, holding down a job, supporting a family. And there's only so much that you can do, with a job environment that's unstable. So it's one of the areas that I'm thinking of looking into right now in terms of expectations of musicians. There's been a few studies I've been involved with here in South Africa in terms of how the pandemic has affected artists and income and so on. And as expected, it's devastating. But we need to see, going forward, how bad it's going to be, because this is going to affect universities. It's going to affect enrollment. If you have a son or a daughter that's now 17 or 18 years old, and your kid came to you and said, hey, Dad, I'd like to go study music, you're probably going to say, wait a minute. I know how tough it is right now. I know what the pandemic has done. You come out in 4 years, I don't know that there's going to be a job for you. I don't know that you're going to be able to sustain yourself. So the question is, are you going to tell your kid, absolutely, go for it. Go ahead and, aim to be a performer. Or are you going to tell them, well, maybe aim to get into education, to teach? So it'll be fascinating to see, what are parents telling their kids? in terms of encouraging and supporting them to get into all of the performing arts. The other area that's interesting to me with this pandemic is that from performing arts research, a lot of artists' routines have now been changed dramatically. You speak to some artists and they tell you, well, I don't have any concerts, so I'm not practicing as much. And then there are other artists who are telling you, no, I'm practicing like crazy because I don't have any concerts.
Mm-hmm.
So their routines have shifted, from pre-pandemic to now during the pandemic. And it's interesting, it'll be interesting to see how all of this has changed, how the performance practices have changed, have medical problems of, as performing arts health of artists, has it changed?
Mm-hmm.
We know that from a mental health perspective, it's definitely changed. There's very little doubt artists are concerned about incomes, about job opportunities, with orchestras having closed up permanently and professional foundations also having shut their doors. How is this affecting the mental health of performing artists? Not just in music. I have friends who are ballet dancers here in South Africa. They have not had work in over a year. And now they're reconsidering. And ballet is one of those fields where if you're not active, you lose muscle memory, you lose your physique. I guess across the field, it's not just music, it's dancers as well. So yeah, it's an opportune time to be addressing these issues right now.
Yeah, and it kind of, your comment about schedules got me thinking a little bit. At least I've noticed colloquially, not to say that all of it has been super formal, but there really does seem to be a keener interest from musicians across the board to just their well-being. I won't say explicitly that like performing arts health is what they're interested in, right? Like the field or the literature, what have you. But just a keener interest in how they're doing, right? Regarding their mental health. I'm sure there's more space to be aware of their issues. Now that some of the hustle and bustle of their normal lives has been kind of cut down a little bit. But yeah, and I have a unique perspective on this. I work as a wine consultant. It's kind of my side hustle at the moment. It's my fun academia, right? And I work at a jazz bar a lot of the time. And pre-pandemic, we're every night. I mean, Tuesday through Sunday, you have a 3 to 4 hour set, and yeah, of course, during the pandemic, that all completely shut down. And it's interesting. There's I retain a little bit of optimism for a return to normalcy, only because it does see that in addition to the performers, there's a desire from the audience, right, for this to get back, right?
Exactly.
And if there's a desire from an audience, there's some kind of financial, catalyst that might help out. So that's where I'm holding some optimism. But to your point, overall, yeah, I think this has become extremely topical. I thought your paper was super topical when I read it. I think music students are good at self-deprecation in a humorous light, where we understand what we're doing most of the time, and especially those of us in the graduate parts of our, we understand what we're doing can be considered fairly to extremely niche, regardless of the breadth of education that we're receiving, and I'd like to think that the stuff we're doing here at the center, leaning into a lot of this quantitative research is it's certainly giving me, a skill set that we can apply not only in music, but in other places as well, which is nice. But yeah, overall it is incredibly interesting, because I've noticed that, the same conversations that happen every winter and spring regarding assistantships, admissions. They're still happening. You know, people didn't stop auditioning for music school and stop auditioning for graduate school in particular. So yeah, it's there's clearly some optimism, but it would be interesting to kind of resurvey all those in the face of
exactly.
all this. So yeah, no, I think that'd be
That's true.
super cool. I'll cut this part out just to kind of proceed where we would go from here. But yeah, thank you for talking about that at length. That was super cool.
No, thanks.
I've always been really interested in that side of things. It was one of the first, like I mentioned, one of the first papers that Dr. Chesky kind of told me to look at. And yeah, it's great to hear you talk about it. Is there a topic in addition to this you'd like to expand a little bit on, or anything that you would like to talk about a little bit?
Just maybe, in wrapping up, just a little about what's happening in this part of the world.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So I've been fortunate that I was, one of the first students from my country to go through and, look at this area of performing arts health in the US and be engaged and conduct research. And I remember when I got back in 2009, 2010, there was no one else doing any of this kind of research.
Mm-hmm.
But it's slowly been growing.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, I conduct research and try to mentor students and encourage students to get involved in this area. And I can't take credit for all of that, but there are students who've been engaging with Dr. Chesky from South Africa. Students have been studying, doing masters. There has been a massive increase in awareness, research, and students wanting to study performing arts health. Mm-hmm. So much so that about 2 years ago, I hosted the first symposium, performing arts health symposium. Dr. Chesky was out here, was one of our featured speakers. And it was amazing that we had interest from the medical field. We had a spinal surgeon, a hand surgeon, audiologists, mental health, general practitioners, music folk, people with doctorates in music, performers, orchestra. They all came together. And I am on a committee with some of my colleagues who are in the process of establishing the first Performing Arts Health Association in South Africa, which is fascinating because, just 10, 15 years ago, there was nothing out here. Mm-hmm. In fact, there was one individual, Dr. Menon, who was a hand surgeon, a very famous hand surgeon from South Africa, who was also a piano player who was writing articles on musicians and some of the issues that he was seeing in musicians in the country way back from the 70s, late 70s, early 80s. But he was just a lone voice. It was fascinating to have him at the conference, being such a legend, having basically spearheaded this field. So it's wonderful. And we see people engaging with the center, like Bridget Rennie Salonen, who's works closely with Kris Chesky. Mm-hmm. But there are other folks who are working with performing arts health centers in Australia, Vienna, and the UK. So for me, it's gratifying to see that this field is growing in our country because it's vital. Mm-hmm. One of the things I've maintained is that the performing arts health of musicians in our country is radically different from the so-called developed world. Because in the US, for example, yourself, you're a musician, you're a performer, researcher. Your side job, your outlet is wine. Mm-hmm. Well, in South Africa, a lot of musicians are struggling to earn an income. Their secondary income will be hard physical labor, mm-hmm. such as gardening or construction, just in order to earn an income. If you think about it, a musician who's trying to work on their technique as a pianist should not be digging up gardens.
Yeah.
It's detrimental, but that's the reality. a lot of musicians are holding down jobs like that just to get by. So I suspect that when we really look at the performing arts health of musicians in our country, it's going to be radically different. I think there's going to be way more injuries. We are not as advanced or as aware as some of the first world countries in terms of proper preventative protocols, wearing gloves, wearing masks when you're working in an industrial area. A lot of our individuals just would go into wherever, whether it's working mines or whether it's construction, hard physical labor, and they don't have the protective gear that's required. Mm-hmm. And who knows what kind of damage that's doing to everything from their lungs to mental health, physical health. So I'm very happy to see that, in our small part of the world, that this area is growing and more people are involved. There's more research coming out. We have people, grad students taking on these areas as well. And again, mm-hmm. It's thanks to our, contacts, connections with people like Kris Chesky at the center and Judy Palak, who've been co-supervising students here in South Africa and so on. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's super inspiring to hear. And yeah, the difference in occupational expectations and I guess identities, for lack of a better word. Because yeah, that's a good point. When you think of side jobs for musicians in the US, it's usually, early on, it might be service work, it might be retail, that kind of thing. And later on in life, there are people that seem to, live on fairly lucrative incomes because they find a higher end side job, whether that's owning a business or engaging in some other probably more lucrative field or something like that. Yeah, but to think of like the external effect that your supplementary income has, especially in light of your work on aspirations of expectations, if it is expected that you will hold some kind of job that can have an outside influence on your playing, and ergo your personal health by the way that it's affecting your playing. Yeah, no, that's something that I certainly can't think of that's been explored all that much here. And certainly deserves attention.
Yeah. And that's true. Also, I travel a lot to other developing countries, I've traveled out to South America and parts of Asia and Thailand and so on. People are holding on pretty physical jobs out there as well. Mm-hmm. A lot of them that are studying because it's different. There isn't that much work, like you say, in the service sector. Mm-hmm. Retail or entertainment in the US, so they've got to hold on jobs that are not conducive to being an artist or a performer due to the physical nature of the work.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of, and I interacted a little bit with I'm blanking on their name, unfortunately, but there's a researcher down in, I think in Fort Worth, if I remember correctly. And they were looking at like the effects of like strength training and stuff on playing, I think piano was their main instrument. So they were kind of looking at the relationship between that. And they seem to find that there's quite a bit of benefit to that. But it is interesting, I find myself trying to do this quite a bit, framing what we're doing through, at least partially through the lens of occupational health, right? Sure. We're doing these things because not only we're researching these things, not only because these issues prove a detriment to your occupation, but ergo to your standard of well-being outside of it, whether it's mental, hearing health, musculoskeletal health, vocal health, what have you. And like you've mentioned, sometimes it's kind of difficult to get people to see it in that light, just because historically music is not seen as a job with occupational hazards, so to speak. But at this point, and this isn't to deride, those that work in office jobs or anything like that, but there's a ton of occupational health outlook on those and interest in those, the issues that arise from that. And so it seems like kind of what you're talking about is kind of seems like the next logical step, is to look at how supplementary income is affecting these things, and is affecting your well-being overall, and not just your well-being, but just your tangible health.
True.
Yeah. It's
very, very true.
It's super fascinating. Yeah. All right. Cut this part out too. Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for going into that. That was super enlightening. Yeah, and I've always found with these interviews that we talk about the research, and most people are aware at this point of the research, right? So the people that are interested in these things, and so you watch, and it's always cool, but there's always these end conversations that always kind of like get to the issue. I had a big long conversation with Dr. Michael Thrasher over at Florida State, and he's really interested in the mental health side of things. I'm really interested in the mental health side of things, and we talked a little bit about his research because he did a lot of like biomechanics stuff with like clarinets and saxophonists and all that fun stuff, and to hear him kind of talk, passionately about mental health in music schools and just how he feels, especially with the pandemic, it's just any issues that existed and do exist are going to be exacerbated, tenfold.
So true.
By this pandemic. And it's admittedly what I'm looking at right now. Of course, it's way too broad to capture in one study, but there's an effort right now, and fields outside of music, I've been doing a much better job at looking at this. There's studies coming out left and right talking about the mental health of various specialized populations. And it's interesting. The NCAA released a survey last fall, I believe. And that's kind of where I got a lot of the inspiration for the stuff that I'm doing now. Just because you compare the social structures of a student athlete and a student musician. Generally, you're paid to practice, you're paid to perform, you're paid to what have you, right? There's always there's that eternal link between the athlete and the musician that probably lacks some empirical substance, but just conceptually, it all makes sense. But yeah, hoping that the research continues on. But anyways, it's always nice to have these little end conversations to the interview, because it seems that's usually where the meat of it comes out, right?
Exactly.
For sure. Okay, I mean, I think we've covered quite a bit. Is there anything else that you'd like to?
No, not really. I think we've pretty much covered most of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, this has been fantastic. So what I'll do is I'll just do a little outro and advertise where where you can find the recordings, and we've been just housing them all on our website.
Perfect.
And we're working on it's a little bit difficult just because there's not really people working in the College of Music right now, tangibly on campus most of the time, but trying to work out some kind of rollout plan to where they're advertising these, but at least for the time being, they're going to be housed on our website, and we have a whole tab set aside for them.
Fantastic. That's great.
All right. Awesome. All right. Well, that is our time for today. Dr. Devroop, thank you so much for talking, sharing your expertise, sharing your experience with us. It's always super inspiring to talk to people who were there, near the beginning or around the beginning of what we're doing now. I'm sure my colleagues will really enjoy watching this. You can find these videos on our website at tcph.unt.edu, and they'll be under the Setting the Stage tab, along with all the other interviews that we've recorded. Again, my name is Brian McGoldrick, and Dr. Devroop, thank you again, and thank you so much for watching.
Thank you so much for having me over, Brian. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.